It looks like we have three people who've already submitted questions for tonight's show. If you're on live, it's always more fun for me to hear you ask the question, and plus I can follow up and engage in a little bit of dialogue. So why don't we go from there? Looks like our first caller is Steve Hacking. Looks like you had a question.
Yeah. Hi, Ken. Can you hear me?
Hey there, Steve. How's it going?
Yeah, yeah. Good. Thanks. Good. 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 Um,
Excellent. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Mine, and it's related to the fascinating book King, Warrior, Magician, Lover.
Hmm.
I read about 2 weeks ago, the first time. I thought it was really interesting. And Diego's questions, I'm very intrigued about the answer as well. And the first question was recommendations would you give to pursue the characteristics of the positive aspects of each archetype, but without overjudging yourself?
Mm. Yeah, it's a great question. And just
So,
for reference for people, if you're not aware of the book that we're discussing, it's a book called King, Warrior, Magician, Lover: Archetypes of the Mature Masculine. It's written by two psychologists, Dr. Robert Moore and Doug Gillette. And I think it's actually, one of the classic books and one that I very much recommend. It's kind of a neo-Jungian point of view about not just masculinity, but I would say describing the self. One of the interesting ideas about it is it has kind of a theory that there's not just one self that we describe as I, but that there's actually sort of multiple selves. You can call them archetypes, you can call them energies, and from a Jungian point of view, he kind of describes them as four. Sorry, I gotta just mute. There you go. In the book, they describe four particular archetypes. So there's the king, the warrior, the magician, and the lover. And if you're talking about the converse, which is the female archetypes, the king kind of obviously is the queen. The warrior, I believe, is sort of like the mother. And then there's sort of a similar magician and sort of lover archetypes as well. So they do apply to both genders, but I think particularly in thinking about sort of the mature masculine, it's written kind of obviously for that audience. Um, in Gillette and Moore's point of view, it helps kind of describe different aspects of the self, and also is it's kind of a framework for thinking about pathology or psychopathology of where sort of men go wrong. So ironically, what a lot of people describe as sort of toxic masculinity, in Moore and Gillette's conceptualization, is really not a masculinity, a toxicity that's inherent to masculinity, but it's really an immaturity. Actually, it's a lack of masculinity. In fact, so in Doug and Robert's model, they talk about essentially as a boy, as he matures into manhood or adulthood, he kind of goes through kind of these sort of immature kind of boy archetypes. So an example of one would be, let's just talk about the warrior archetype, right? There's different sort of positive and negative polarities to it where it can go sort of wrong. So if you think about kind of a boy who has like too much an undeveloped sort of warrior archetype, that's the kid that becomes like a bully, right? And similarly, if someone is very weak in terms of their warrior energy, and is kind of a pushover, then that becomes the kid that becomes bullied, right? And you see kind of both of those extremes, obviously, in any schoolyard around the world. Now, if you don't sort of mature into a proper masculine sort of warrior archetype, which is centered around taking action, discipline, pushing towards your goals in a healthy and mature way, the warrior archetype would become in the kind of positive, and by positive I don't mean good. Positive is in like the excess of it would become essentially a sadist or someone who's sadistic, right? So you could think about this as like the soldier who like shoots up a village, or the boss that's verbally and emotionally abusive to their direct reports. So that's kind of an undeveloped adult sort of warrior archetype. And then conversely, on sort of the negative, and negative again, not meaning bad, but the absence of adult warrior energy would be someone who's masochistic, right? And punishes themselves, beats themselves up excessively. And so, to your point, someone who is judging themselves excessively, it may be sort of a reflection of sort of a masochistic, sort of lacking warrior archetype. So that's the basic framework. I highly recommend folks actually read the book. It's a very intriguing read. You can obviously buy it on Amazon. And if you want sort of the cliff notes, Art of Manliness actually published a 4 or 5 part blog series that summarizes essentially these archetypes. And so there's an essay essentially portraying each of them. I find it particularly interesting, particularly as a clinical psychologist, because it's not the framework that I use. I'm not a Jungian, or I don't practice sort of psychoanalytic psychodynamic therapy, which is kind of this older school of thought that informs this book. But it is an interesting explanation. It's not sort of empirically derived, and what I mean by that is, I always tell people, are there actually 4 archetypes, and are they a king, warrior, magician, lover? I don't know, and I don't think science has validated that. So is it a scientifically proven framework? Probably not. However, is it a useful framework, right? If we kind of transcend like the strictness of a randomized control trial or evidence, I would say it is, because it does explain real world behavior that you see. Like if you see a bully on the schoolyard or a very demeaning boss, you have to ask yourself, why is that guy or why is that kid a jerk, right? And what do they need to not be a jerk? And this provides a framework for thinking about that. So one thing, for instance, that I think is actually very useful is Gillette and Moore talk about these as energies, almost as external to the self, right? It's not that the bully or the mean boss is intrinsically evil and it's an inherent part of their personality or character, but it's almost as if they're possessed. If you almost think about it like a spirit or a demon, not literally, but if you use that metaphor, if you're sort of possessed by these energies, in that you have these energies, right? But you don't know how to sort of control it. You don't know how to channel it appropriately. You don't know how to apply it in a mature way. Then you'll become sadistic, right? And you become the bully or the mean boss, right? Where that tendency to like be impatient, and you want to get stuff done, and you want to push forward, and you want to create something, that is good energy, right? But it can obviously be applied in a bad way, right? In terms of abusing people, or obviously abusing yourself, right? And beating yourself up, and how come I'm not achieving? How come I'm not attaining all of these standards, right? So these are, if you think about it as energy and it's external, it really becomes, how do I channel that energy in a positive, pro-social, and productive way that's in an act, sort of my philosophy way. It's all about whether it's aligned with your values or not. So an example of that is, let's say I say one of my values, one of my core things that are important to me in life are having close, meaningful relationships, right? So that's kind of a key guiding light in my life. But my warrior sort of archetype or energy is not fully developed, and I have a tendency to be kind of mean and sadistic, as we're talking about. So there are choice points that come along. So let's say you're a boss and your employee doesn't finish a project in time that he promised he'd get done. And so that warrior energy to go and want to execute and win the battle gets sort of triggered, because now you're upset that someone let you down, and there's a blockage towards your goals of not getting the thing done that you had asked to be done. So it'd be very easy to kind of fly into a warrior rage and go yell at your employee and direct report and say, why didn't you get this done? And be very sort of sadistic and very punitive towards him, right? but that may be in conflict with obviously that value that I had mentioned of having, close, meaningful relationships that are centered around caring about people. And so, I think in recognition of that, it can help. So to answer your question, I think having contact and clarity with your values can help drive people away from automatic tendencies, and reorient them and say, even though right now in this moment I feel angry because I, wanted to go execute this goal, and this person is getting in the way of that, and I want to go punish them because they're literally blocking me from getting the things I want to have done, and I want them to feel the pain that I feel in a very sadistic kind of way. But that would create another kind of pain, which is the cognitive dissonance of violating your values and the things that are important to you in terms of being a good boss and having close, meaningful relationships with them. I think if you can recognize that in the moment, right? So what's happening is you're recognizing your thoughts and feelings of anger. You're able to diffuse from them in the moment and say, oh, okay, I feel this way, but just because I feel angry does not mean I need to act angry, right? So I don't need to necessarily give into impulsivity in that moment. I can kind of watch it arise. I feel red in my chest. I feel myself breathing really hard, and I want to go yell. But in that moment, I ask myself, what do I want to be about in this particular moment? Do I want to be a jerk or an asshole boss that people live in fear of? No, that's not who I want to be. That's not reflective of my values. And so you're going to take that energy and you're going to channel it elsewhere. Now you may want to give them that feedback and say, hey, it's not acceptable to, miss your deadlines, but how can I help you? What can I unblock for you? Why did it not go right? And what can I do to make sure that it doesn't happen again? Right? That's obviously a more mature conversation that you'd have with your employee, but you're still obviously pushing them and making sure that you are getting your goals met. So that's the way that I would frame it is, whether you call them personality traits or you talk about them as sort of king, warrior, magician, lover archetypes, they're tendencies, they're predispositions. They're not your destiny. You're not fated just because you're not sort of fully developed in some of these, that it automatically will drive your behavior. And so I do think using certain tools and techniques. So one of them that I mentioned is sort of diffusion, which is to not take thoughts and feelings literally, right? You can just recognize them and say, I see that I'm angry. I feel that I'm angry. I don't need to act on it. That's diffusion, essentially. And then reorienting towards your values, which is, okay, well, what do I want to be about in this moment? How do I want to treat this person? Not because I'm socially obligated to even, but just because of how I want to be in this relationship. And then using that to take committed action towards, okay, I'm going to give this person feedback, but I'm not going to yell. I'm not going to throw a tantrum. I'm not going to abuse this person, even though that burning desire may be there. So hopefully that's a concrete example of how I think one can start to mature, towards these things. And if you're curious, there's actually a quiz that someone created online that can tell you how developed you are in terms of your king, warrior, magician, and lover energy. And at the end of the show, I'll actually put it into the channel, and so you can take the quiz and see, where are you stronger, or where are you essentially more mature on these energies, and where are you kind of weaker, and there's work to be done.
Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. How about we make it a little bit more concrete? I know you sort of posted a little bit about your self-assessment, about your own sort of warrior and lover and weaker than your king and magician. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? I'm just curious how your lived experience of all of this is. How do you make sense of it? How does that apply to your life?
Yeah, absolutely. Proviso that I read the book just over a week ago, so my
Fair enough.
not that long. But when I read it, I was not only interested in the pyramid within each archetype, i.e., the more kind of balanced warrior versus the masochist versus the sadist, but I'm interested in the balance between different archetypes, between king, warrior, magician, and lover.
Mm-hmm.
But even if you're doing, a couple of them well, you've got drawbacks, and some of the examples in the text where that you can be a great king, but you can lack passion as a consequence, because you're thinking about being fair and even across things. And I kind of self-diagnosed from reading it, and thought that I'm okay on king, and I'm okay on magician, because as in my job, I assess companies. I need to I investigate them. I need to produce a fair view of them, and I developed a skill base to do that. But it really resonated how the warrior required you to be really quite clear and often brutal with decision making. To cut things out, and I've got a tendency to keep things for a very, very long time. The lover, I have a tendency to be balanced, and if I'm honest, my wife would say sometimes too balanced. So not being that person in the moment and grabbing the day. And I have sort of experimented by having warrior days and lover days. Lover in the sense of that passionate person.
Right.
And it's eye-opening. And I did, I have made decisions to cut things out and stop them as the warrior, and make decisions about cutting clients that weren't valuable to me.
Right.
And I've experimented. I know it sounds strange, but it's almost acting as if by just staying in the moment and enjoying. I've got a little daughter, and just enjoying looking at the flowers with my daughter as the lover, and it's very rewarding. So those are sort of tangible things. Them, but I definitely see, if I think about it, as one of those old-fashioned things you had on stereos to make sure you're balancing across the different sounds. I'm up on two levels. I'm up maybe on bass and down on treble.
Yeah.
That sort of rebalancing, graphic equalizer, isn't it? That rebalancing is definitely something that I'm going to work hard on.
Yeah.
That's my lived experience of it, and early days, but positive days. And like you, I lacked any sort of when the evidence given in the book was movies, that didn't show strong empirical evidence for the archetypes, but I guess he was making his point by using those movie scenes.
Right.
And that's valuable in and of itself, to use them as good examples of immersion, if you will. So you can kind of act as if by visualizing that. So those are my kind of lived experience examples.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. It's kind of funny. I was like having a little bit of self-reflection, and I was like, if someone is not familiar with this book and he's hearing these guys talk about their king, warrior, magician, lover energy, they'd be like, what? What kind of hippie shit is this? But if I actually reframe it and I said, okay, forget the jargon, because there is a little bit of jargon and symbolism in each of these things. I actually like it because, when you describe a king, there is almost a collective unconscious of all of the characteristics that entails, because you might have seen a King Arthur movie, and there's a lot of qualities that literally in that one word, paints a very vivid picture. The downside, though, is, people are like, this is very like symbolic and metaphorical, and what does this practically mean? So for the clients that are like really concrete, logical people, the way that I describe king, warrior, magician, lover is really simple. I'm like, look, just think about these as values. You don't need to believe them as like spiritual energies. I'm a rational scientist, so I certainly don't take it sort of literally. But a way that you can think about it is a king is just leadership. And I think most people realize, especially men, you need some sort of leadership in your life. Whether you're the head of a company, or you're just the head of your family, or you're just the leader of yourself, you need to be in charge. So I think everyone can gravitate around that. Warrior, I think, is like, look, it's the part of you that needs to take action, and also it's your physicality, right? Like if you think about it, warrior can represent your health, and you obviously need to invest in your health and your well-being. And get strong and do weight training and all that stuff. So most people agree that's an important value. The magician, if you think about it, that's the creativity and obviously your career, your professional development. That's obviously a very important and valued domain in your life. And then obviously your lover is your relationships, both romantic and close interpersonal relationships. So if you asked anyone who you don't have to be a Jungian, is being in charge of your own life, is taking care of your health, is having a good career and learning and having close intimate relationships important to you, basically everyone would say yes, right? And that's another way, of course, of diagnosing, or as you said, sort of self-diagnosing where you're stronger or weaker in these archetypes. Where, for instance, if you're indecisive, it's almost certainly a sort of a quote unquote warrior issue. If you're not taking care of your health, I would say it's sort of a warrior issue, and that you're not taking actions towards your health. And then same thing, if you're kind of anhedonic, and meaning by that you're lacking passion or energy in your life, and it's so ho hum, and you're just dragging yourself through the day, and there isn't that passion and spark, whether romantically or just even aesthetically, right? In terms of, like you said, like enjoying time with your daughter or enjoying a beautiful movie, then maybe you're lacking a little bit in that lover energy. So you can use it as a framework. I don't think they need to be everything needs to be perfectly balanced, like it's 25 25 25 25, and all your energies need to be exactly the same. I think in reality, and this is the beauty of like the diversity of mankind, some people are going to be stronger in some of those energies than others. So for instance, obviously, if you're a CEO, you may be really stronger in king and warrior energy because you're obviously a leader of a company, and if it's a startup, you probably have to take a lot of decisive action all the time. While let's say you're more of a creative, you're a designer, you're an artist, you may have a lot more of that lover energy because you channel that or you sublimate that, even perhaps libidinal energy into your work. So I think it is okay that they're not perfectly balanced, but I would say if there's great discrepancies that you see, right? Where let's say if you take the quiz, or as we're talking about this and you're listening and you're like, yeah, I am missing that joie de vivre, that joy of living that I used to have when I was younger, a student, then it's like, okay, maybe I do need to do some work around getting in touch with that part of myself, whether you want to call it the lover or not. Then I think it's a clue about where you need to go. I actually, by the way, really like your idea of like different, you can almost dedicate different days to enhancing that side of you. Which, if you think about, kind of culturally, we kind of do that with the artificial distinction between, weekdays and weekends, right? Where weekdays you can say maybe it is a little bit more magician energy. We spend a lot of time on our careers, our professional development, especially as men. And on the weekends, hopefully, if you have the freedom to not work on the weekends, that you can get in touch with different parts of yourself. Maybe you're doing a little bit more workouts, doing a little bit more physical warrior. And same thing, you're engaging more socially and romantically with the lover. So I do think compartmentalizing it, as you said, and making sure like, okay, let me dedicate a day to accentuating this part of myself, or investing the time in doing things that are in line with that energy, can be a good way of getting back in touch with the parts of you that maybe that you haven't known for a long time, or perhaps even have been suppressing. That's the thing that I see in a lot of men in particular. I particularly work with a lot of CEOs in my private practice. They're overwhelmingly dominant in magician energy, right? I would say anyone who's really intellectual, really professional, that archetype, it like the energy, it overpowers or overwhelms. The way that I actually think about this, that it's very useful, is instead of thinking about them as energies, you can almost think about them as, you're kind of a father to four kids, right? Or maybe even teenagers would be a better analogy. Four very rebellious, energetic teenagers. And you're trying to get them to all cooperate because you're taking a trip somewhere, right? So you're driving your SUV and you got four teenagers, and you can imagine how challenging that might be to get them all in line. And they're all vying for different things. They may be vying for your attention. They may be vying for who's playing the radio, and they may be fighting with one another. Like the two might be beating each other up in the back seat. And to make that kind of real, you can think about how that actually applies to your life, right? Where if you're spending 40, 50, 60 hours a week on your professional career, which is understandable, the magician may sort of be the oldest brother and may crowd out all the other siblings in terms of dominating that person's life, right? And so you see sort of that imbalance happen over time in some people, and it suggests that, okay, in order to rebalance, like I said, it doesn't have to be perfect, doesn't have to be completely equal, but if the magician is sort of coming at the expense of the lover, then that may be helpful. Or same thing, if having to be in charge comes at the expense of the warrior, and you've started to become more and more indecisive over time, or not invest in your health because you're just like, oh, I'm so busy running my family or running my company, I can't sort of do the things that I want to do or need to do to take care of myself, then it suggests that those are areas for rebalancing. So I think that's a very useful way of thinking about it too, is notice sort of where there are imbalances in your life and what sort of energies or archetypes that corresponds to, and think about as you said, compartmentalizing it, giving different times that allow them to come out. So obviously, like the hour a day that you spend at the gym, pure warrior, right? Let the warrior run free, listen to some heavy metal or some Jocko Willenick, get pumped up, and just let that sort of that teenage son sort of drive the SUV for that hour anyway. But obviously, maybe when you come home and you want to be attentive to your wife or your daughter, you're like, okay, I got to switch modes a little bit, be a little bit more into that lover archetype, thank the warrior for his duty, his service, right? In service of the king or of you as a whole or as an entity, and say, all right, I need to calm down. I need to be a little bit more present. I need to be a little bit more caring, empathic, compassionate with these people. Let me sort of have the lover sort of take over the steering wheel, so to speak. So I think you can actually do that consciously, right? Just like how I'm using that language, you can almost like trip the switch in your mind and say, okay, I'm going to let this part of me or this energy kind of take the wheel, take charge, however you want to say it, and imagine how that changes, right? Because obviously maybe a warrior walks very forcefully, chest up, proud, almost like you imagine a soldier marching, which is a very different kind of embodiment and body language than a lover would, which is going to be softer, smoother, just a different kind of feel, maybe warmer in terms of how they talk, how they walk, how they feel. And so if you can almost step into that picture and physically kind of step into that, when you literally open the door, when you walk home and see your wife and daughter greet you, they'll feel that, they'll resonate that, and hopefully you'll act accordingly. So anyway, we talked a lot about this subject. I think it's fascinating. We can continue to talk about it in further shows, but we'll share some resources for folks if you want to dig in, the quiz, the summary, and the book after we do this show. But let's move on to other questions. And Steve, thank you very much for asking that one.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it. Really resonates.
Absolutely.
So it looks like next Rihan is up.
Rihan, are you on the line?
Yeah, I'm here.
Hey there. Welcome.
Hey, I actually asked a question about Winston Churchill on the last show.
That's right.
Unfortunately, this next question is not going to be related to Winston Churchill.
Otherwise, we can have the Winston Churchill podcast on our in my next life.
Exactly. 40 ways to look at Winston Churchill. Gretchen Rubin, everyone should check that. So my question is actually kind of totally unrelated.
Mm-hmm.
It's more so about therapy and finding help, right?
Yeah.
And I think there's a few really common bottlenecks as to why people can't find help. I think one part of that is pricing, but I think another part of that really is just this massive database of different therapists and psychiatrists and all of these psychotherapists that like have for people that aren't really aware of what all these labels are and quite frankly what's quote unquote wrong with them or what the issues are. How would you recommend someone go about to find good help, right? Because speaking from personal experience, I've been through, a series of different therapists that,
Mm-hmm.
that, quite frankly, weren't helpful in any way, shape, or form. And
Sorry to hear
at
that.
the end of it, and at the end of it, you're left with, kind of these massive bills that you're irritated to pay because there was nothing to come from that, right? So
Yeah.
my question to you is, how would you recommend someone go out there, not knowing completely what's going on with them, not knowing completely who they need to be able to kind of, measure
Mm-hmm.
success in terms of, healing or whatever that looks like? How would you advise someone to go out and find good help wherever it might lie, and then this vast sea of selection?
Yeah, great question. It's actually a really common one that I get asked as a psychologist and psychiatry professor. By the way, is this still something that you're facing? Are you like going through this process right now? It sounds like you haven't found what you're looking for. Are you trying to find a good one currently?
Yeah, so the reason I'm actually asking, I actually sent you a DM on Twitter,
Uh-huh.
which you were kind enough to respond to. I utilized that platform and actually, like, again, this same bottleneck, right? There's a bunch of people that all claim to help you work through these things in life, and it's really difficult, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some people will charge you for a consultation that virtually does nothing. So I actually didn't. It was helpful because it's an array of people that might be able to help, but
Yeah.
wasn't really able to find exactly what I needed or who I needed for that matter. So to answer your question, yes, it is something that I am currently dealing with. It might be selfish that I'm asking for myself, but I'm
No,
hoping,
this is
it isn't.
hey, this is a call-in radio show. I want everyone to ask personal questions because I think it's much more interesting than just asking random intellectual questions. I actually prefer it because then it feels like we're actually helping people this way.
Yeah.
What was the platform that I recommended over the DMs? Just to jog my memory.
Yes, I'm sorry. It was like an ACT, so it was everyone that practices acceptance and commitment therapy. It was I forgot exactly what the website was called. If it's any help to you, the UI on that.
Yeah, it's terrible.
It's terrible. It's like the worst. Like the filtering system is like archaic. So if that's any help, that's what the website was.
So okay, yeah, I remember where I was coming from with that. Look, unfortunately, good help is hard to find. That's the reality, and unfortunately, the variance of quality in the mental health field is quite wide, which basically means there are some really good therapists and some really bad ones, unfortunately. And I hate to say it as being part of the field, but it's the reality of the fact. And you've had that experience as well in terms of not finding what you're looking for. Here's the good news. It's not the modal experience. 80% of people who go to therapy say they're better off for it. Now you can interpret that if you're glass half full or half empty kind of person. In other words, 4 out of 5 people are satisfied. 1 out of 5 people are generally not. So I think that's actually encouraging, and I think it's particularly important to tell that to men because men are the more reluctant to go to therapy, especially because they don't think it'll be helpful, it'll be a waste of time, waste of resources. The good news is, hey, look, if I had to take a bet and the odds were like 80% that my bet would succeed, pretty good odds to me. I would take that bet, especially if it's going to inform the quality of my life. Now, it may not be always on the first hit or first try that you get that 80%, but I think that's the general. I don't think they were asking like based on that. They're like, in general, has therapy been helpful to you? And most of the time it is. So that's the good news. The bad news is I think you can increase your likelihood of it being 80%, 90%, 95% successful. And generally the first, second try is if you do more homework up front in terms of picking a therapist. So I would say here are 3 criteria that are really important in terms of what you look for. Number 1 is, I always say, start with the financial aspect of it, is just make it clear what you can afford, because that will inform how you find the person and, unfortunately, some of the quality as well. In that, if you're obviously very limited in your income, you will probably need to go through your insurance. If you have health insurance, I hope everyone does. Then maybe different if you don't. But if you do, then the best thing to do is to go through your insurance company, whatever it is, Blue Cross Blue Shield, go on their website and then find that providers that are in network. The nice thing about that is if you do that, depending on obviously the type of insurance that you have, you'll know how much you can pay. It could be a copay. Insurance varies a lot. It depends on, it could be $10 copay, it could be a $65 copay, or you pay 50% of the fee. Every insurance plan is different, but it'll be usually substantially reduced for two reasons. One, if a psychologist like myself contracts with a health insurance company, we essentially have to negotiate a rate and say, I'm providing a discount because the insurance company is providing me with a steady stream of customers, and so it's capped at a certain rate. Let's say it's 150 per hour, and I can't even legally charge. Let's say my normal rate is 200 an hour. I can only charge 150 through insurance, and I can't ask the patient for the extra $50. So you're capped at that. And then second, obviously the insurance should be paying the bulk of that if it's in network. So you can actually have pretty cheap therapy where it's like 10, $20 a session. That makes it quite affordable if you go through your insurance. The downside though is if you're going through your insurance, it obviously is a much smaller pool of people. And the second challenge is once you start calling up those folks, a lot of those folks will be full or not taking any new patients anytime soon. So it does require a little bit of legwork to email, call people until you find someone that's like in your area, takes your insurance, and can see you relatively soon. If you have the financial means and blessing to be able to pay out of pocket, your odds of your flexibility of finding people is going to be much better, and the odds that you'll find someone better, I hate to say it, are better because quite frankly you get what you pay for. And unfortunately 90% of mental health professionals do not take insurance. It's not because we don't want to. I don't take insurance because it's too much of a headache in terms of paperwork and managed care and dealing with insurance companies. And plus it introduces this third party that's in between you and the patient, where it's much better to have a direct relationship with someone and say, look, this is what I charge. I can give you a discount, I can adjust it, but it's just you and me, versus paying a third party that quite frankly doesn't add any value to it. So the challenge is if you know that 90% of people don't take insurance, and then probably 99% of the good people don't take insurance. I shouldn't say it's that high to discourage people, but a lot of the good people, quite frankly, if they're good enough, they have a steady stream of clients, and you get paid more if you don't take insurance. So why would you? So there's a difference. There is probably a little bit of a quality difference between people who take insurance and those who don't. That may be an unpopular opinion, but there's probably a hint of truth to it. You'll have more flexibility and choice. Most people in private practice do not take insurance. So just kind of figure out your financial status. If it's more like I can pay $20 a session, probably go the insurance route. If you can pay $100 to $200 a session, go the private practice route and cash pay. You can always, if you're paying cash, also negotiate rates to some degree. Like I work on a sliding scale with folks where depending on their income, or if they're a startup founder, depending on their fundraising status, I adjust my rates quite a bit. I would say the variance, for me is like sometimes 5x more for, the founder of $100 million funded company versus someone who's just bootstrapping a company hasn't raised. So I don't charge people the same thing to make it more financially affordable. So that's the first thing. The second thing is look at their training, right? So again, this is a little bit of a generalization, but doctorate level mental health professionals are obviously more educated than someone who has a master's degree, and possibly in some states less than that. But a psychologist usually has a PhD or PsyD. A psychiatrist usually has an MD or a DO degree. And the quality of people who can get into a clinical psych program or medical school, because I train psychiatrists, is quite high. Like I went to UCLA, which is the #1 clinical psych program in the country. The acceptance rate's 3%. Does that guarantee that they're a good therapist? No, but you can at least guarantee that they're pretty fucking smart, and at least are pretty knowledgeable and aware of what they're talking about, versus someone who went to some for-profit professional school. You don't know that. They could be really good, they could be really terrible. So that's what I would say is look at their degree. Doctorate level people generally tend to be better, but of course there are some great MFTs, LCSWs. It's called a marriage and family therapist, or masters in social work. But I would say if I had to randomly pick a name out of a bag and one was a master's level person, one was a doctorate level person, more likely than not, the doctoral level person will be better. The second thing is look at what school they went to. If it's a recognizable school, like I went to UCLA, you've heard of UCLA. It's the best public school in the country. Probably pretty good. If it's Alliant or Agrasy or some for-profit university that doesn't have an undergraduate college, you've never heard of it, all they do is churn out PsyDs, it's usually a bad sign because they're owned by Goldman Sachs or some other large investment bank, and it's essentially a for-profit degree mill like Trump University. I hate to say that, but there's some degree of truth to it, and the quality of those people is not good because those people couldn't get into for the most part, a legitimate, university, and they kind of pay for their degrees. Also an unpopular opinion, but I've seen it enough that I feel like I can say that. So that does matter. And then the third thing that you're looking for is what's their orientation. And by orientation, I mean like what's the framework in which they're practicing. We've been talking a lot about this King, Warrior, Magician, Lover stuff. That comes out of a neo-Jungian or what's called a psychodynamic approach. If you like that stuff, then I would say try to find someone who describes themselves as a Jungian or psychodynamic therapist, because they will probably get this idea of archetypes and they'll work with you on that stuff. I actually don't because that's not the school of thought that I'm from. I think I generally focus on evidence-based behavioral therapies, and by that I mean ACT, which is the one that I recommended to you, acceptance and commitment therapy, or CBT, or what's called cognitive behavioral therapy. Those two are considered strongly evidence-based, meaning there's a lot of science behind them that works. So it gives you a degree of confidence that, especially if you're dealing with like a pretty standard issue, you're talking about depression, anxiety, there's a ton of evidence that they work very well for the treatment of depression and anxiety. So look at how they describe their orientation, and especially if they have any sort of extra credentials to validate that. So for instance, if one's a CBT therapist, everyone says they do CBT, or anyone can claim they do it. But if someone, let's say, is board certified, right, in cognitive therapy, or has a certification from the American Academy of Cognitive Therapy, they clearly went the extra mile to get that certification, and are probably going to be better than someone who just, I don't know, took a weekend workshop and who knows if they actually practice CBT or not. And then the final thing I would say is you may not know what issue that you're dealing with. If you do, some people sometimes have a sense. They may realize, for instance, I'm very anxious. They don't know what that means. They don't know if it means they have OCD or what the anxiety is or what the particular anxiety disorder is, but they know that they're a worrier. They know they're anxious. They know there's something wrong on that spectrum of things. You might want to look for people who have particular expertise in that. Now, everyone will theoretically, again, claim that they treat depression and anxiety. But, for instance, if you know, you're like, man, I wash my hands 30 times a day. I wonder if I have OCD. It looks and sounds like OCD from what my friends tell me or what I watched on Discovery Channel. You may want to find someone who really specializes in that. So, for instance, here in LA, there are entire practices and clinics. All they do is OCD treatment. They're super specialized in it. They're world class. They've published books on it, the people who run the place. They give talks on it. So when you look at their profile, you're like, this person is a true specialist, right? And so in that sense, it can be very helpful if you have a particular issue and you have at least a sense of what that issue is, to really go to someone who's good at that. And I always share this as a personal example. I generally work with adults. I have colleagues who are child psychologists, but I don't do any kids. I don't do any couples. So if someone comes to me and they're like, treat my 14-year-old son, or I'm having marital problems and I want you to work with my wife, I refer to colleagues, because I'm like, I could work with you, but I'm not going to be the best at it. And there's other folks that, quite frankly, can do that better than anyone else. So make sure that they're really competent in your area of expertise. One last final note is, unfortunately, I hate to make the analogy of like any other, hairdresser, mechanic, or any other service-oriented business, is word of mouth does matter, right? Like it's hard to tell whether the person, just in terms of the interpersonal match, is good. But if someone raves about their psychologist and then gives them that positive reference to you, maybe you'll be good with them, maybe not, but it's always going to be better than a random person. So if you are fortunate enough, especially geographically, to ask people around your network for a recommendation or a referral, people aren't very public about going to therapy, right? So most people won't be like, "Oh, I have this great therapist, you should go." But if you ask them, if you ask your network, let's say, you ask your group of friends, or you ask even your company, right? You just say, "Hey, look, I hopefully there's no too much shame about that. Any recommendations for great, whatever it is, dentists or psychologists?" People will make really good referrals, and that actually is an effective way of going about it. I would say if you particularly know professionals, that's even better, because you think about like a doctor's doctor, like who would the doctor go to? Because they know better than anyone who's really good and who's not. So people will ask me oftentimes as well, and I know, probably people more local to my network, but that can be a good way of going about it. One last topic on this is this notion of doctor shopping. I'm actually not a fan of. Sometimes people do this thing where they're really obsessed with the match, and I think it's a little overblown. I might have mentioned this. There's no research to suggest that demographic matching is a good predictor of outcomes. What I mean by that is, if you're a 35-year-old white male, you do not need a 35-year-old white male to treat you. Or if you're a 65-year-old gay Jewish woman, the only person if you think that the only person can understand you is someone who's literally a clone of you, it's going to be impossible for you to find the right sort of therapist. That you do not need to have the same condition or demographic background or religion to be able to effectively treat people. If that was true, then only ex-cancer patients could be oncologists. But we know that's not true. Instead of looking for your spiritual match or your best friend, the number one thing, if you ask therapists themselves, if you ask someone, how does a therapist pick a therapist? The number one trait that they always say is competency. They just try to find someone who's really, really good at what they're doing. And of course is like compassionate and warm, as well. But most of the time people in the profession are going to be good about that. So instead of, I don't recommend people literally go to 3 therapists at the same time and then shop around and be like, which one did I like the best? And then I'm going to pick them. It's almost like the dating analogy of like trying to have 3 girlfriends at once and then figure out which one you're going to marry. There's something weird about that dynamic. What I would suggest is, if you're going to do it sequentially. Do your research, find a list, make a top 3, go to 1 and see if it works. If you don't feel like it's working out within 3 sessions, 5 sessions, not that your life is better, but at least you're like, do I feel heard, understood, and respected? Are we working on what we're working on that I want to work on? And it seems like it's a good fit for me. So far so good. Those are 3 important questions you can ask yourself. Then yeah, continue with that therapist. If not, then feel free to go to your backup or your number 2 option. But I generally prefer the sequential approach, because at least you make at least a commitment to trying to make the relationship work, versus if you're seeing 3 people at once. First of all, it's expensive if you're going to try to see three shrinks at the same time and then, bet on the winning horse. It takes a lot of your time. It's like, can you imagine seeing 3 people in the span of a week or 2? And then also you just sits there and it creates a weird competitive dynamic. And most people don't do that for like their other doctors. You don't go see 3 primary care physicians or 3 dentists to find a match. You just pick one, and if it works, you stay. You don't, you go to the next one. So I don't think psychologists are actually that different, and people overblow the spiritual kismet and chemistry that is required. You need to make sure that you feel, like I said, heard, understood, respected, that the person is compassionate and empathic. But you're not trying to find a best friend or a significant other. So I think people need to downplay that importance and just try to find people who are really, really good at what they're doing, because that's actually the most important thing by far. A really competent psychologist, psychiatrist, or mental health professional will be able to get good results or better results with the majority of people than basically anyone else, even if the other person's like more demographically suited to them.
Yeah, that's all super helpful. It's great to hear you kind of elaborate on the nuances of it. If I could just ask one more question, I don't want to be that annoying
Sure.
guy that
No,
asks
it's fine.
questions. But the second thing is, like, so I've paid anything on a range from like 1, using insurance, to 2, just paying like anywhere. I think the most I went to was like 400 a session. It was ridiculous. So my question is, like, do you think that they're, like, in your experience, are therapists, or kind of like the rate that they charge, is at a certain point, is it like just unnecessary, like colognes, like when you're paying $300 for a cologne, you know for a fact you're just paying for like the name of it, like some guy that was on, someone's podcast. Like,
Yeah.
Can you categorize that? Like, do you know, like, okay, at a certain point I'm paying for this guy's name, he treated, so and so person, or was on so and so podcast. Like, is that a thing? Like, if you saw that some doctor in this field was charging a certain price, you'd be like, that's just ridiculous. Like, it doesn't matter if you treated Beyonce in her teens, like, like that.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Surprisingly, not really. There may be some exceptions in that, I don't know, maybe there's some celebrity shrinks out there who charge like a ridiculous amount. But I think they're few and far between. And unless you're going and seeking out Dr. Phil, most people aren't going to run into that issue. So I would say for the most part, I wouldn't worry about it. And second of all, I actually do think there's an association between cost and quality. And the reason is you can't just make up a rate. I mean, you can, but no one will pay it. I could say I'm going to charge $10,000 for a session, and quite frankly, no one's going to pay me for that. So people can make up stuff, but it kind of has to be what the market will bear, right? So if someone's charging $400 a session and they're maintaining that rate over time, it's probably because they're able to get people to pay that. And then the question becomes, why are they able to charge more than other people? Let's say the going rate is closer to, I would say, $200 an hour right now in a major metropolitan city, even if it's cash pay. So if the person's able to charge 400, they have a greater demand, essentially. Are they better? Not necessarily, but usually demand and quality usually go hand in hand. The exception is if someone's a really exceptional marketer, like they're just in the media all the time and they get a lot of people, and so they're able to be like, okay, I'm only gonna see the folks who are willing to pay me $400, or they have some referral source, like they made friends with all the pediatricians in Baltimore and they just send them all these clients and they're like, sure, I'm gonna charge more. But I would say generally therapists are terrible in terms of like marketing, so it's usually not for that reason. But you'd know, right? If they're a super slick person who's on a TV all the time, then I'd say yes, that may be more of that camp of those folks. But generally speaking, the people that I know that charge a lot are the people who can charge a lot, and they can charge a lot because they have the demand and the skills to be able to do that. I'm definitely in the camp. I probably charge in the top 1% of people. But the reason I'm able to do that is because I have a very niche practice. There's very few people who are like a medical school professor and have been a tech CEO, and 80% of my clients are tech CEOs. And so they're looking for something very particular. And second of all, they're mostly not paying out of pocket. They're actually paying through their companies. It's an operational expense to have executive coaching. And so I can charge more because I know guilt-free that I'm not like draining someone's bank account. It's like they're generally VC funded companies that have millions of dollars, and them paying a few thousand a month is a drop in the bucket to them. They pay more for that for random software and office space. So it's more than justifies it as an expense. So you have to kind of understand why they're charging that much and such. But look, it's never a guarantee, but it's a correlation, right? I would actually argue that the cologne analogy is an apt one, because I am a cologne aficionado. I really like them. I have $30 colognes and I have $300 colognes, and the $300 ones are better. Like quite frankly, not always, but if I had to randomly pick them, they can just use better ingredients, right? And that money does go somewhere. So yes, I would say in cosmetics that's true, right? Like, is a $300 facial cream better than a $30 one? Probably not. But if you're talking about something that's like craft, which I would argue cologne making is, and same thing, therapy is a craft. Yeah, usually you pay for what you get for. But here's what I would say for everyone: you don't need to spend an arm and a leg to do so. I've actually turned away clients who are willing to pay me a lot of money, but it was clear that it would actually cause financial distress, because they're like, I can't pay you this week, I can pay you this next week. And I told him, I was like, look, come back when you're in a better financial position. I try to discount it down to as low as I possibly can. Like sometimes I charge even a sixth of what I charge of other companies, clients. But if it gets to a point where it's unaffordable, like don't financially harm yourself. But I do think it's generally a good investment, and most people do find ROI. I know it sounds crazy to pay whatever 100 or even hundreds of dollars per week or month, but if you're talking about literally your mental health and well-being, there's no price on that. If you literally think about billionaires who can afford anything, and like a Howard Hughes kind of type, where they have OCD and they spend the end of their life covered in filth, and die alone because they have untreated mental health issues. I don't know. You can't really put a price on that. So obviously, though, the price that you put on it is contingent on getting benefit out of it. So worst case scenario, you spend a few $100, it doesn't work out for you. Sure, you spend more than that trying a new restaurant. So think about it like that. It's not the worst loss in the world, and the upside, quite frankly, is great. Where as opposed to a nice dinner, you feel good for a few hours. With a good therapist, you'll feel good for the rest of your life.